I have known the Duke of Hartmere for 23 years, and in that time I have watched him outwit bankers, outlast 3 county elections, and reduce a Privy Council minister to actual tears with a single measured sentence. Elliot Haddon, 7th Duke of Hartmere, is the most rational man I have ever met. He does not believe in luck. He does not believe in presentiment. He most emphatically does not believe that an 81-year-old woman who once threw a chamber pot from an upper window at a suspected suitor can see the future of his heart. Which is why, when I tell you that Lady Philippa Haddon saw it coming before any of us, before him, before me, certainly before Miss Celia Morrow, I want you to appreciate the full, magnificent absurdity of that fact. It began in October, which is the season Hartmere Park looks best and Lady Philippa is worst. The great aunt arrives every autumn without warning and without invitation, commanding the blue suite, rearranging the library according to a system no one else can fathom, and introducing some new scheme she insists is for the estate's benefit. I had ridden up from London with Elliot that year, and we found her in the drive directing 2 footmen and a cart loaded with what appeared to be a disassembled harpsichord. "Philippa," Elliot said from his horse, in the tone he uses for things he intends to stop immediately. "Don't use that voice," she said without looking up. "I've brought a companion. She is entirely necessary, and you'll like her enormously." "I have no use for a companion." "Not for you, obviously. For me, my joints." She gestured vaguely at her hands. "And I need someone to read to me in the evenings who does not read like a man falling asleep." This was aimed at me. I thought it somewhat unfair, as I had only done it the once. Miss Celia Morrow arrived that same afternoon, having traveled separately by the post-coach from somewhere in Dorset, a village near the sea, I learned later, where her uncle kept a small rectory and a large collection of sermons nobody asked for. She came down from the coach herself, without assistance, carrying a single trunk and wearing a gray wool traveling dress that had seen better seasons. She was perhaps 26. She had ordinary brown hair arranged plainly, ordinary features, and the kind of steady, unfrightened gray eyes that look at you as if they've already decided not to be impressed. Elliot, standing on the steps as she approached, said, "Miss Morrow," with the same neutral courtesy he'd give a ledger entry. She said, "Your Grace," with a curtsy that was correct and brief, and then looked past him toward the house with clear, practical interest, as if she were calculating which rooms caught the morning light and how one might use the time. He blinked. People do not generally look past Elliot. That evening at supper, Lady Philippa said, "She is the wrong match entirely, of course," and I understood that we had arrived at the campaign. "She is not a match at all," Elliot said. "She is your companion. Those are not the same thing." "No, I mean she's wrong for you. Too plain, too sensible, no family worth mentioning, no fortune. Terribly wrong. I just thought you ought to know." He studied her. Elliot has an exceptional instinct for ambush. "Philippa." "Yes." "You are scheming." "Darling, I am always scheming. That's different from being wrong." She turned to her soup. "More claret for Lord Fen, he looks cold." I was not cold. I was trying not to laugh. The first scheme came 4 days later. Lady Philippa developed a sudden passion for botanical watercolors and required Miss Morrow to sketch the winter garden, which was, conveniently, accessible only through the Duke's private library at the precise hour Elliot habitually worked. This was so transparent that I wondered if the old woman had decided subtlety was beneath her. Elliot came to his library at 9 and found Miss Morrow at his writing table, not sketching, as it turned out, but seated with one of his agricultural reports open in her lap, reading it with what looked very much like genuine attention. She had her head bent and one finger moving along the figures in the margin, the way a person reads something they intend to understand rather than merely absorb. "Miss Morrow," he said. She looked up without flinching. "Your Grace, Lady Philippa said the winter garden was through here. I went through, found it too cold to sketch comfortably, came back, and couldn't help noticing your drainage report for the South Fields. I'm sorry." "It was on the table." She held it out. He didn't take it. "You read drainage reports." "My uncle's rectory shares a wall with a farm that floods. I've developed an interest." She stood, set the report precisely where she'd found it, and moved toward the garden door. "I'll tell Lady Philippa the light wasn't right." She left. Elliot stood holding his own doorknob and looked at the report for a long moment. Then he sat down and went back to work. He did not mention this to me. I heard it from the footman. The second scheme was grander and failed faster. Lady Philippa arranged an impromptu musicale, invited 3 neighboring families on one day's notice, and seated Miss Morrow at the harpsichord, the disassembled one, now assembled in the south drawing-room with remarkable speed, with the clear intention that she would play magnificently and Elliot would be struck dumb with admiration. Miss Morrow played competently. That is the charitable version. She played a Handel minuet with earnest accuracy and some hesitation at the more ornate passages, and when she finished she turned to the room and said, "I ought to have told Lady Philippa I play adequately but not beautifully. I hope nobody came for the music." There was a brief silence. Then Mrs. Calder of Calder Mill said with some warmth, "That was perfectly pleasant, my dear," and the conversation moved on. Elliot, beside me on a settee, said very quietly, "She announced her own limitation." "She did," I said, "before anyone could observe it themselves." He was quiet for the rest of the evening. I noticed he did not leave early, which was unusual. Elliot generally leaves musicales with the same relief a man feels putting down a heavy trunk. Lady Philippa, informed of the scheme's results the next morning, was untroubled. "The point was not the playing," she said, when she found me on my way to the stables. "The point was what she did after." "And what's the point of the point?" I asked. She looked at me with the expression she reserves for people asking obvious questions. "He's been proposed to by 6 women of fortune and family, Aldwyn. Every one of them played beautifully. Not one of them ever admitted to a limitation in her life." She went back into the house. I stood in the stable yard, thinking about that for rather longer than I expected to. December came. The families began to disperse to their London houses or their winter estates, and Hartmere settled into a companionable, quiet Elliot working, Lady Philippa holding court in the blue suite, myself reading in the library or riding the east fields when the frost lifted. And Miss Morrow, reading aloud to Philippa in the evenings, writing letters at the small desk in the morning room, walking the kitchen garden in her sensible boots and gray cloak, doing all of it without fuss or performance. She had, I noticed, a particular quality of being present without demanding that her presence be acknowledged. Most people require the room to adjust itself to them. She adjusted herself to the room and was then simply, usefully there. Elliot began to notice her the way you notice a clock that keeps correct time, not with drama, simply with a growing sense that it is reliably, quietly there. He noticed when she gently corrected a housekeeper's accounts that had been quietly inflated, not with accusation, but with a pleasantly worded question that had the same effect. He noticed when she persuaded Lady Philippa out of a scheme to rearrange the East Wing servants' quarters by pretending to agree, and then proposing an alternative so sensible that Philippa believed it had been her own idea. He noticed, one evening in the library doorway, that she was reading not one of the novels she borrowed for herself, but his tenant survey for the north quarter of the estate, and that she had left a small sheaf of notes in her even, unpretentious hand beside it. He picked up the notes, he read them, he set them down. He came to find me in the billiard room. "She's identified 3 tenants who are underreporting acreage," he said, "by cross-referencing the tithe records from the rector's map, which apparently she brought from Dorset." "She brought tithe records from Dorset," I said. "She said they were useful for comparison. She wasn't wrong." I looked at him. He was looking at the billiard table with the concentration of a man who is not looking at the billiard table. "Elliot," I said, "how long have you been reading her notes?" "I haven't been reading her notes. I found one set tonight." He picked up a cue. "It's a minor thing." "Of course," I said. "She's Philippa's companion." "Undeniably." He played the shot. It went wide. He stared at it, which told me more than anything he might have said. In 23 years, I had never seen Elliot miss a billiard shot while attending to the game. The third scheme in January was nearly a masterpiece. Lady Philippa contrived a sprained ankle, thoroughly convincing. I watched her practice the limp on 3 separate mornings and was genuinely impressed by the commitment, and persuaded Elliot that she required him to escort both herself and Miss Morrow to the village for the quarterly market, as her ankle prevented her from driving, and the footmen were all needed on the estate that particular morning. A situation which Elliot might have questioned had he been thinking about anything other than the North Quarter tenants, and possibly the notes. We set out in the smaller carriage. Lady Philippa managed her sprained ankle with remarkable vigor until we arrived at the market, whereupon she discovered a lace-maker of exceptional interest. She collected lace the way other people collect grievances, exhaustively and without apparent limit, and was immovable for 40 minutes. Elliot was left to navigate the stalls with Miss Morrow. I followed at a distance. They walked without speaking at first, in the manner of two people who are perfectly comfortable in each other's company, and are not making a performance of the fact. They looked at winter vegetables and at the saddler's display, and at a collection of second-hand books spread on a trestle table under an awning, where Miss Morrow stopped and spent some time. Elliot stopped beside her. He said, "Do you want one?" "I have enough books," she said, which was so clearly false given the state of her room that he looked at her sideways. "Which one?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then she picked up a small, battered collection of essays on natural philosophy and showed him the spine. It was missing the front cover. The remaining pages had been read so many times the binding had given up. "This one, but it's already been read to pieces. It doesn't seem worth the tuppence." He took it from her. He paid the tuppence to the stall-keeper, who looked rather surprised to see a man of Elliot's obvious standing purchasing a book without a cover for tuppence, and gave it back. She looked at him the way one might look at a man who has done something entirely unexpected and not at all unwelcome. "Thank you," she said simply, and tucked it into her basket. They walked on. The frost had lifted overnight, and the January sun came through thin white cloud in a way that made the market square look gentler than it probably was. After a moment she said, "You didn't want anything from the stalls." "No. You came because Lady Philippa arranged it." A pause, yes. "She arranged the ankle as well, I suspect." Another pause, slightly longer. "Almost certainly." Miss Morrow smiled, not the polite variety, not the one she produced for introductions. The private kind, the one that appears when something has genuinely amused her, and she is not troubling to conceal it. "I won't tell her you know," she said. "She'd only plan something more elaborate." He looked at her sideways. "Elaborate how?" "Last autumn she told me she was considering engineering a blizzard," Miss Morrow said serenely. "I don't know how she intended to manage that, but I've stopped being surprised by the ambition." He made a sound. It was brief and involuntary, and it was a laugh, the kind that escapes before a man has decided to allow it. The first one I had heard from him in 3 months. I turned and walked back toward the lace-maker. Lady Philippa's ankle recovered that afternoon. Elliot said nothing about it. February was quiet. The schemes paused, which I found more alarming than the schemes themselves. Philippa in motion is manageable. Philippa in stillness is calculating something with a longer fuse. Elliot rode the north fields with his steward and found the acreage discrepancies exactly where Miss Morrow's notes had indicated. He instructed the steward to begin the correction of the 3 leases. He did not mention this to her directly, or so I thought. He left her a note, a single line, no salutation, that read, "The north quarter was as you marked, 3 leases amended, thank you." Set on her desk in the morning room, under a small pewter paperweight, where she would find it when she sat down to her correspondence. I know about the note because she showed it to me, not to Philippa, on a morning when she found me alone in the library. She held it out with a slightly careful expression, the way a person carries something they are not yet certain what to do with. "Is this normal?" she asked. "No," I said. She nodded slowly, looking at it. "I see," she said, and didn't say what she saw, but folded the note and put it away inside her book with the precise, deliberate motion of someone choosing to keep a thing. I did not tell Elliot about this conversation. It seemed privately hers. In the second week of February, on a cold afternoon when the frost had not lifted all day, I came upon Elliot in the library doing something he does not ordinarily do, not reading, not working, simply sitting. The fire was going. His papers were in order on the desk behind him. He had a glass of brandy untouched beside his chair, and he was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man engaged in an argument with himself that he is losing. I sat down across from him and waited. "She corrected Philippa's steward this morning," he said at last. "On the linen inventory, the man has been counting short by 1/3 for 6 years. "Did she make a scene of it?" I asked. "No, she handed him the correct figure and told him she must have misread and would he mind checking once more." He paused. She had not misread. No, I said, she wouldn't have. He looked at the fire. She gave him the way out, he said, which was the first time he had ever articulated what he noticed about her rather than cataloging the facts of what she had done. I said nothing. He picked up the brandy and put it down again. Aldwin, he said. Philippa brought her here on purpose. Unquestionably. For me. Beyond doubt. He was quiet for a moment. The difficulty, he said finally, is that I cannot tell any more whether I find her extraordinary because she is, or because I have been primed to find her so. I thought about this. Would the distinction change anything? I asked. He looked at me with the expression he gives questions that have arrived at an inconvenient time. Then he said, no, and picked up his papers, and that was the end of that conversation. March arrived, and with it Lady Philippa's masterwork. She invited, in rapid succession, Lord and Lady Vane of Vane Cross, 3 of their adult children, a canon of the cathedral who owed her a favor since 1809 and had been waiting nervously for it to be called in, and a Mrs. Hester Dolling, a widow of considerable connections and more considerable fortune, whose interest in the Duke of Hertford had been a subject of London speculation for the previous year. Philippa framed this as a spring gathering, hosted it in the Hertford Long Gallery, and arranged seating at the supper table such that Mrs. Dolling was positioned directly beside Elliot at the head, with Miss Morrow placed at the far end of the table beside the canon, who was hard of hearing and talked exclusively about drainage. This was, I realized when I studied the seating plan for the 3rd time, not a scheme in favor of Miss Morrow at all. It was a scheme designed to make Elliot notice precisely what he was being given as the alternative. Philippa had staged an absence and called it a dinner party. It was, I thought, her most sophisticated work. Elliot arrived in the long gallery and saw the arrangement, and his expression did not change, which is how I knew it had changed in some interior room he was keeping to himself. Supper began. Mrs. Dolling was beautiful and confident and very well informed about the opera season. She occupied Elliot's attention with considerable skill. I watched him respond with impeccable courtesy, which is not the same as interest but is, from the outside, indistinguishable. He was too well-bred and too controlled to show anything as obvious as restlessness. At the far end of the table, Miss Morrow listened to the canon with the patient attention she brought to everything, handed him the salt 3 times without being asked, and did not once look toward the top of the table. She ate her meal and talked to her neighbor on the other side, one of the Vane daughters, who seemed to find her company agreeable, and gave no indication that she was aware of being placed at a remove. Lord Vane's eldest son, a man of 23 named Geoffrey who had consumed more claret than judgment over the course of the fish course, leaned across to the woman beside him at approximately the midpoint of the meal and said, with the confidence of the carelessly oblivious, "Who's the plain one at the end? The companion? What's she doing at the supper table?" He said it in the way of the young and thoughtless, not a whisper, not a declaration, something in between, loud enough to carry 2 places in either direction. Miss Morrow, across from him, could not have helped but hear. There was a fractional pause, the kind that pretends not to exist. What happened next happened quietly, which made it worse, or better, depending on whose side you were on. She looked at Geoffrey Vane with those steady gray eyes and said, "I'm Lady Philippa's companion, yes. The Duke includes me in the household gatherings, which I've always considered a mark of his particular thoughtfulness. He does not divide people by income in his own house. You must find that rather unusual." Geoffrey blinked. "The Duke of Hertford," she continued lightly, without malice, without raising her voice, "has quietly amended 3 tenant leases this winter to correct discrepancies that had stood unchallenged for 12 years. He did not announce it, and he did not require thanks. That is, in my experience, what a man looks like when his sense of honor is real rather than performed." She picked up her fork. "I find it restful, actually." She turned back to the canon. The table went briefly, electrically quiet, the kind of silence that pretends to be nothing and is everything. Then Lady Vane said something gracious, and the conversation resumed, and Geoffrey Vane addressed himself to his fish with the expression of a young man reviewing poor decisions in real time. I looked down the long table toward Elliot. He had stopped speaking to Mrs. Dolling mid-sentence. He was looking at Miss Morrow, who was not looking at him, who was listening with apparent genuine interest as the canon described a Roman drainage aqueduct near Bath, with an expression I had not seen on his face in all of 23 years of friendship. It was the expression of a man who has just understood something he should have understood months ago, something that was in front of him in every morning room and library and billiard game and quarterly market, and who is calibrating, very precisely, what to do about it now. Lady Philippa, at the head of the table, was buttering a roll and looking at nothing in particular and failing entirely to conceal her satisfaction. The meal finished. The company moved to the drawing room. Elliot made his excuses, quiet, courteous, not open to argument, and was gone. Mrs. Dolling watched him go with the expression of a woman who has just recognized the game has not been quite what she understood it to be. I found Miss Morrow 20 minutes later, standing in the winter garden through the library door in her indoor dress and no wrap, looking out at the formal beds asleep under the March cold. The garden was pale and still. She had her arms folded against the chill, I thought, but there was something else in the posture. Something private that was not distress but was close enough to being moved that she wanted a moment alone with it. Before I could announce myself, Elliot came through the library door behind me and nearly walked into my back. He stopped when he saw her through the open door. I stepped aside. She heard the door and turned, expecting me, and found him instead. There was a silence, not an uncomfortable one, the kind that has something in it. "You are not wearing a coat," he said at last, which was not what he had intended to say. I could tell from the way it landed, too practical, too immediate, not what he'd planned on the way down the corridor. "No," she agreed. He shrugged out of his evening coat, a fine dark thing that had been cut for him in London, and held it out with the straightforward manner of a man performing an obvious correction. She took it after a moment, which in the winter garden in March was entirely sensible. She did not protest that he needn't. She said, "Thank you," and pulled it around her shoulders and looked at him. "Miss Morrow," he said. "Your Grace, what you said at supper." "I said what was true," she said simply. "I didn't intend for you to hear it." "Why not?" She considered this with the honesty I had come to expect from her, the kind that takes the question seriously instead of deflecting toward what is easier to say. "Because it was not a bid for your attention. I just disliked what he said about you. It seemed worth correcting." "About me? About you?" Another silence. He was looking at her the way he'd looked from the far end of the supper table, but now there was no length of polished table between them and no polite conversation to perform. "You have," he said at last, very precisely, as though he had been building toward a clear statement and had found it, "been the most consistently surprising person I have encountered in many years. And I have been, I think, unconscionably slow." She looked at him, the gray eyes steady and unfrightened, exactly as they had been on the first afternoon in the drive when she had looked past him toward the house. "Slow to what?" she asked, because she was not going to allow him to be inexact about this, not now. "To see what ought to have been evident," he said. "From the drainage report, if I am honest, possibly earlier." A pause. "Almost certainly from the market." The corner of her mouth moved. "The drainage report," she said. "You brought tithe records from Dorset. I thought they might be useful." "They were." He took one careful, deliberate step toward her, which in Elliot constitutes an act of considerable internal boldness, compressed into something that looks to the untrained eye like a man adjusting his position in a garden. "I am asking, I am not scheming, I am not Philippa, I am asking plainly whether you would be willing to remain at Hartmere, not as Philippa's companion, as something more than that." He paused for the length of 2 measured breaths. "If it is something you might want." "It needn't be, and I will not press you, and I won't." "Yes," she said. He stopped. "I was," she said, "beginning to wonder when you would get there." His expression, then, was something I had no prior reference for. Relief, and underneath it something warmer. A man stepping out of a house in which he has always been slightly cold into air that is, unexpectedly, precisely the right temperature. He looked at her in his evening coat around her shoulders in the March garden, and some last internal door that had been standing shut for a very long time opened. "Philippa," he said, not to Miss Morrow but quietly to the darkness of the formal garden, the bare stems and the cold starlight, "has been correct about one thing in her life." "Only one," Miss Morrow said. "Substantially one," he said, and she laughed, the private laugh, the one not intended for an audience, and he smiled. and I retreated back through the library door because I was not, despite what Lady Philippa often implied, entirely without tact. I told Philippa that evening. She was in the blue suite with her embroidery and a sherry she was not supposed to have. "Well," she said. "He proposed," I said. "She accepted." "Yes. You arranged the entire winter." "I arranged the opportunities," she said. "They managed themselves." She set down the embroidery. "He has spent 7 years since his father died running an estate as though running it well were the whole of a life. He needed someone who would see him doing it and understand what it meant, not applaud it, understand it. That requires a particular kind of mind and a particular kind of character." She picked up her sherry. "I have been watching Celia Morrow for rather longer than this autumn, incidentally. Her uncle and I corresponded for years." She reviewed his sermon notes. "She reviewed his sermon notes," I said. "And corrected the Latin." Philippa looked serenely into her glass. "I have been planning this since she was 22. I simply had to wait for Elliot to be ready. He is extremely sensible, my nephew, but sense can be a very slow ferry." I looked at her. In 30 years of knowing Lady Philippa Haddon, I believe this was the moment I most fully understood her. She was not a meddler in the ordinary sense, a woman with too much time and too little occupation managing other people's affairs for want of her own. She was a woman who had watched a system, the marriage market, the aristocratic social order, the great grinding machinery of fortune and family and connection, sort people into wrong arrangements for 8 decades, and who had decided that where she had the wit and the influence to correct it, she would. Quixotic, certainly. Presumptuous, undeniably. Outrageous in its particulars, from the disassembled harpsichord to the fake ankle to the seating arrangement that would have made a military tactician envious. Also, in every essential particular, precisely right. "One question," I said, "the blizzard. Were you genuinely considering engineering a blizzard?" She put down her sherry and looked out the window at the March night with the expression of a woman whose plans have exceeded anyone's reasonable expectations, and who sees no reason to be modest about it. "I had some preliminary thoughts," she said. I left her to her embroidery. They were married in June at the small church near Hartmere Park, which Elliot had selected because it did not require a London spectacle, and because its register of marriages dated to 1603, and he found that, as Miss Morrow had said to me once about the Duke himself, restful in a reliable, unperforming way. The ceremony was quiet. The breakfast afterward was not large. Lady Philippa wore green, which no one had advised, and looked magnificent. I stood beside Elliot at the chancel and watched him stand at the end of the aisle as though all of the certainty he had ever applied to ledgers and surveys and agricultural reports had found at last its correct and proper object. He was very still. He was not nervous. He had the look of a man who has finally, after considerable delay, arrived where he ought to be. Celia came in a pale gown that suited her exactly, simply made, well-fitted, nothing performed, with her hair put up, and a few escaping strands at her temples, and those gray eyes that met his at the end of the aisle with the same steady, unfrightened directness they'd brought to every room at Hartmere since October. She walked to him without drama, without the slightest suggestion that she was performing a happiness she did not feel. He offered her his hand, she took it. "She is the wrong match entirely," I murmured to Philippa beside me in the pew. "Absolutely," she said in a tone of total satisfaction. I don't know what he was thinking. Elliot, some years later, when I asked him to characterize his marriage for a younger cousin considering his own prospects, thought for a long moment and said, "I cannot tell you what to look for. I can tell you that when Celia reads a drainage report, she finds things I missed. That when she disagrees with me, she tells me precisely why and is usually correct. That she has never performed a happiness she did not feel or concealed a concern to spare my feelings, which is, I have found, the most valuable quality in any long partnership." He paused. "And that Lady Philippa was right, which I still find somewhat galling." That seemed to me the whole of it, said better than I could have managed. A plain rector's niece from Dorset with tithe records and gray eyes and an unflinching habit of accuracy had walked into Hartmere Park and become the still center of the most rational man I knew. He had been the last to understand it. She had been patient. His aunt had been relentless and outrageous, and in every essential particular entirely correct. Some things cannot be arranged by logic alone. Sometimes you need an 81-year-old woman with a very long view, a disassembled harpsichord, a convincing fake ankle, and the patience of someone who has been watching the right pieces move toward each other for years. And sometimes, at the last, in a winter garden in March, with a borrowed coat around her shoulders, you need a woman to tell the whole truth without expecting anything in return. That was the moment Elliot hadn't came home,